Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE was established 14 years ago after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Middle East, but Middle East gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries, which benefits only the American 1%. Although that was the real reason, the Bush and Obama administrations launched wars in the Mideast and killed well over 1 million people with a propagandistic excuse that they were fighting terrorism. But what, after all, is terrorism? There are, in fact, official definitions of terrorism in U.S. and British law and in U.S. Army manuals, all about the same. To take one succinct official definition, terrorism is, quote, the calculated use of violence or threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature through intimidation, coercion, or instilling fear, close quote. In other words, the military operations themselves of the Bush and Obama administrations fall under their definition of terrorism. In fact, state-directed international terrorism in the technical sense of U.S. and British law. For exactly that reason, the official definitions are unusable by our government. They fail to make a crucial distinction. The concept of terrorism must somehow be crafted to include foreigners' terrorism against us, while excluding our terrorism against them, which is often far more extreme. To devise such a definition is a challenging task. Accordingly, from the 1980s, there have been many scholarly conferences, academic publications, and international symposia devoted to the task of defining terrorism. In public discourse, the problem does not arise. Well-educated Americans have internalized the special sense of terrorism required for the justification of U.S. state action and control of the domestic population, and departure from the canon is generally ignored or, if noticed, elicits impressive tantrums. But it becomes clear that Noam Chomsky is correct when he says, quote, everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, there's really an easy way. Stop participating in it, close quote. He's pointed out that Obama's secret drone program is the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times. Obama has killed more than 6,000 people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children, with drones alone. The New York Times says that Obama chooses the targets himself from lists prepared by the CIA, and his drone assassination program continues today. Remarkably enough, President Obama has managed to hide much of his terrorism from the American people, or at least distract them from it, although the rest of the world recognizes it. President Obama says he's fighting terrorism, but in fact he's creating terrorists. He has attacked 8 countries, 2 more than George Bush, and he directs a private presidential army called Special Operations Forces of more than 70,000 people, active in more than 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. Today, the Obama administration is conducting wars throughout the Mideast, acting with belligerence towards China, and promoting an ongoing proxy war against Russia and Ukraine that has already killed more people than America's client Israel killed in Gaza in 2014. We must demand of Obama and his successor, probably Clinton, that they, 1, end the drone assassinations, 2, bring all U.S. troops and mercenaries home, 3, closed 1,000 foreign U.S. bases in the Mideast and elsewhere. No other country has more than 12. 4, end the provocations of Russia in Ukraine and China in the South China Sea. 5, end support for Israel's apartheid policy, worse than South Africa's. And 6, support negotiations among the U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and the Kurds to end the Syrian and Iraqi civil wars. In a book on the last presidential campaign, President Obama is quoted as follows: "Turns out I'm really good at killing people," Obama said quietly. "Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine," close quote. However ironically he meant it, the quote has not been denied by the White House, and it turns out to be true. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you won't hear much about it in the American media. We'll mention some of it tonight, beginning with Ron Zook.
Yes, well, I want to comment again on the killing machines that we're accumulating. I've mentioned before the long-range heavy bombers that we are said to need more of, or a new generation of, now that the B-52s are aging. Stuff is appearing on the NewsHour, WILL TV, about the need for a new generation of nuclear submarines, Ohio-class submarines, which are only used offensively, if you think that there's some distinction that can be made between offensive and defensive weapons. I don't think that, but anyway, nuclear submarines firing long-range guided missiles are, it seems, only useful for attacking or perhaps conceivably striking back against attackers on the USA. So the latest turn in the military hardware show, which still goes on, very little is being said about it, is the delivery of a nuclear submarine to Israel, built in Germany, and apparently with American money. There's a little story here from the Christian Science Monitor by Joshua Mitnick, January 25th. Facing threats and opportunity, Israel's forging a Mediterranean alliance. Israelis who once had their backs to the water are looking to the Eastern Mediterranean to find partner countries to exploit natural gas reserves and bolster Israeli security. Some color, with Israel's flag flapping over the country's newest piece of military hardware. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu descended very carefully into the nuclear submarine INS Rahav, built in Germany, at its inaugural ceremony this month in Haifa. There's been little tentative, however, about Israel's recent push westward into the Mediterranean Sea with a mix of added naval force and energy diplomacy. Israelis had turned their backs to the water for decades as neighboring armies routinely threatened to throw the Jewish state into the sea. But in the past 5 years, Israel has begun to see the Mediterranean as a strategic area rather than merely as an apocalyptic graveyard. That area holds threats and opportunities: rising instability in the region post-Arab Spring, a shift in U.S. priorities, and an increased Russian presence, and the need to develop offshore national natural gas reserves. So as a result, a Navy that was once mainly a Coast Guard has been bulked up with new vessels to protect Israel's gas fields and defend the mainland from rocket attacks, and so on. The relatively new axis of Israel, Greece, and Cyprus will be on display January 28th at a three-way summit in Cyprus, highlighting a dramatic improvement in relations between Greece and Israel. The agenda includes discussion of a possible joint military exercise and potential for economic cooperation with Egypt. It's the latest in a series of high-level consultations between the countries, and so on. So meanwhile, the war of attrition goes on in Palestine, Israel. We hear daily about the stabbing attacks apparently with kitchen knives on Israelis by the Palestinians. We're hearing less about the killing of Palestinians by the Israelis at a rate generally between 5 and 6 to 1. So it's a very favorable to Israel kill ratio going on there. The story that appeared this week, which I thought was a little strange, we hadn't heard more about it before. New York Times, January 23rd, U.S. relies heavily on Saudi money to support Syria rebels. When President Obama secretly authorized the CIA to begin arming Syria's embattled rebels in 2013, the spy agency knew it would have a willing partner to help pay for the covert operation. It was the same partner the CIA has relied on for decades for money and discretion in far-off conflicts, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Since then, the CIA and its Saudi counterpart have maintained an unusual arrangement for the rebel training mission, which the Americans have codenamed Timber Sycamore. Under the deal, current and former administration officials said the Saudis contribute both weapons and large sums of money, and the CIA takes the lead in training the rebels on AK-47 assault rifles and tank-destroying missiles, and so on. The support for the Syrian rebels is only the latest chapter in the decades-long relationship between the spy services of Saudi Arabia and the United States, an alliance that has endured the Iran-Contra scandal, support for the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan, and proxy fights in Africa. Sometimes, as in Syria, the two countries have worked in concert. In others, Saudi Arabia has simply written checks underwriting the American covert activities. And so there's a lot going on that we're not being told about and know nothing about. Next point. IDF, Israel Defense Force, admits spraying herbicides inside the Gaza Strip. The Army says that the aerial spraying was meant to enable security operations, quote unquote. Palestinian farmers say hundreds of acres of crops were damaged or destroyed. For years now, the IDF has unilaterally maintained a lethal no-go zone on the Palestinian side of the border with Gaza. Now it seems it has implemented a no-grow zone, and so on. Final main point. Our Secretary of State, John Kerry, has been lecturing the Chinese for not being aggressive enough, not being tough enough on North Korea. U.S. prods China on North Korea, saying soft approach has failed. The Obama administration warned China on Thursday that its approach to reining in North Korea had not worked and said the time had come to end the business as usual with the country Beijing has supported for the past 6 decades, meaning North Korea. In his strongest comments since the North Korean nuclear test on Wednesday, Secretary of State John Kerry has told the Chinese counterpart Wang Yi in a phone call Thursday that China's approach to influencing North Korea, issuing warnings by also trying to warm long-strained relations, had proved a failure. So it's another one of those messages, let's you and him fight, that we get from Israel occasionally concerning the USA and Iran. It's become better known that for years, the U.S. and Israel have been carrying on campaigns of subversion and sabotage in Iran. And we're not hearing a lot about that, but little bits of it are becoming public as time goes by. Final minor point, I like to avoid saying anything about current political conflicts as we view politics in the USA in a completely trivial way, Republicans versus Democrats, for example. From Consortium News, Robert Perry, January 24th, Hillary Clinton seeks neocon shelter. Stunned by falling poll numbers, Hillary Clinton is hoping that Democrats will rally to her neocon-oriented foreign policy and break with Bernie Sanders as insufficiently devoted to Israel. But will that hawkish strategy work this time? Neocon superstar Robert Kagan told the New York Times in 2014 that he hoped that his neocon views, which he now prefers to call liberal interventionist, would prevail in a possible Hillary Clinton administration. After all, Secretary of State Clinton named Kagan to one of her State Department advisory boards and promoted his wife, neocon Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, who oversaw the provocative regime change in Ukraine in 2014. So that's pretty vague. There's a lot more to be said there about the adventures and increasingly mysterious activities of Victoria Nuland in the Eastern European area. So I hope we'll hear more about that today. According to the Times article, Clinton remains, quote, the vessel into which many interventionists are pouring their hopes. Mm-hmm. Kagan is quoted as saying, quote, I feel comfortable with her on foreign policy. If she pursues a policy which we think she will pursue, it's something that might have been called neocon, but clearly her supporters are not going to call it that. They're going to call it something else. Mm. So, yes, I think that's true. So we have this lineup then on one side, which looks rather pro-war to many of us. Mm-hmm. The Israel lobby, Hillary Clinton, the neocons, and can anything stop them from opening up the next front in Eastern Europe, Southwestern Asia? It's not looking good. Well, that's enough droppings from the racetrack, as I call it, for today. So, Carl.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air, and like the Obama administration, we will pivot to Asia with Karen Aram.
Okay, before I move on to Asia, I do want to make a couple comments here in respect to some of what Ron said, because otherwise I'll forget, okay? Basically, one thing I want to point out is that this is coming from RT, from a lawyer on RT. Sisi, the military leader of Egypt, who gained his control by way of a military coup. Trying to remember what year that was. I think it was 2012 or 2013, I'm not sure. But we have continued to support him with military weapons, whatever. But evidently, he is now killing more Palestinians than Israel, okay? He's focusing on Gaza, while the Israelis are focusing on the left bank. So I think that's something worth looking into. The second point I want to make in regards to something you just pointed out here, Ron, regarding the article about the CIA receiving money from Saudi Arabia. According to Tim Weiner's Legacy of Ashes Inside the CIA, going back to the 70s, the CIA was receiving funding from Saudi Arabia, China, from Taiwan, many nations at the time. So we're talking about the 70s. And if I recall, it was something like they were asking for $32 million from Saudi, and then they were getting a little lesser amount from China, a little lesser from various other ones. And this was in regards to control of the Middle East. So it goes way back. It's nothing new. It's just now it's hitting the mainstream press. And as far as North Korea, they're one of the few friends that China actually has, one of the few allies. So why would China take a hard stand against what North Korea is doing? But at the same time, I've always pointed out what China does, usually that sort of thing, they'll do it behind closed doors. And because they have a lot of business interests going on, and it is between members of the party, of the reigning members of the party. I have to point something out. My secretary was a member of the Communist Party, okay? Because she'd been a top student when I lived there. So there are thousands that are are members of the party, okay? But you have that reigning elite that are in charge. Okay. So, but aside from that, there is a real history there as far as North Korea is concerned. There are reasons for doing what they're doing. Our presence there, I forget which parallel it is, but all of the troops we have, what is it?
I think it's 38th.
38th parallel.
Right.
All of the military troops
39.
we have in Korea. North Korea and South Korea, from what I have read, they would really like to reunite.
Yeah.
And it's our presence and our lack of, I don't think there's ever been any kind of a real agreement. But this is something, again, I'll look more into so I can speak
There's
on it.
been no peace treaty, technically.
Peace
there's
treaty.
still a war, yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly. So, you know, we have to recognize that prevents North Korea from progressing, and we won't go into their leadership, which of course is abominable, but it also has kept them in the dark, kept them isolated, kept them closed off. And so it's going to take more than just us telling China, which is such a joke, us telling China they have to take a hard line, given our provocations in the South China Sea against China. So, but what I'd like to pivot to Asia is actually today a pivot to Latin America.
Okay.
Because now this is by Bill Van Auken. This was the 13th of January. The title of the article is Pentagon Calls for Pivot to Target Latin America. And he takes this from an article. He says the U.S. has steadily escalated military provocations in the South China Sea, which we know, sending warships and strategic bombers within close proximity of Chinese-claimed islets, while encouraging Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, and other nation-states to pursue a confrontational approach toward Beijing. Now, this approach found expression in an article published in the most recent edition of Parameters, the Journal of the U.S. Army War College, which is entitled Expanding the Rebalance, Confronting China in Latin America. The author is Colonel Daniel Morgan and is described as a senior officer with extensive White House interagency and international experience. The Army War College functions as a prep school for officers being groomed as the Pentagon's next top commanders, while also serving as a kind of military think tank dedicated to elaborating U.S. imperial strategy. Now, Colonel Morgan's article is presented as a warning that China's expansion into Latin America might well outflank the U.S. rebalance in Asia. Governments such as, he goes on to say, governments such as Peru, Chile, Colombia, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica have pledged international political support for Chinese interest, arms sales, and military training and education cooperation. He says China has become Latin America's second largest export market after the U.S. It has already supplanted the U.S. as the #1 trading partner in Brazil, Chile, and Peru. Beijing has also emerged as a top creditor to the region with loans to Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, and these are in the billions each. So the article presents increased Chinese military ties to Latin America as a threat to U.S. interest, citing recent or pending arms deals that the U.S. has with Venezuela, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, and other countries, together with official visits by military delegations, as well as military officer education exchanges. But as we know, most of it is all business-oriented. And here's the best part that really put a big smile on my face. Colonel Morgan condemns China for its no-strings-attached policy on trade. Now let me repeat that. No strings attached policy on trade, credit, and investment, saying that it serves to strengthen anti-U.S. governments like Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. Now, are they really anti-U.S. government? But the no strings approach is what I have discussed. Others have given credence to it, that when China goes in to do business, whether it's in North Africa, whether they're taking over a military facility base in Djibouti or wherever, they go in and they build up the infrastructure, they make money off their business deals, They don't care what your politics are. They don't care if you're a dictator or not. They don't care if you're a Democrat. All they want is to do business. But it also means, and this is what we have to understand, it also means is that they don't require those governments to do their bidding, whereby the U.S. has propped up military dictatorships over many, many years, requiring them to do our bidding. Usually it's military, buying our military weapons, et cetera, et cetera. And then when they don't do our bidding, when they actually might want to do something on behalf of their people, whatever, that's when we get rid of them. But either way, it's a no strings attached, meaning we don't interfere in your personal affairs, and we don't want you, like they're doing in Southeast Asia with Japan, with Indonesia, with Vietnam. We're remilitarizing these nations in order that they support us against China, which really does go against their own best interest.
Thank you, Karen. You're watching Aware on the Air. Our plan for the next part of the program is to go back around and make some comments on the things that have been said already by the panelists. I'd like to begin with Ron's point on the new killing machines that the U.S. government is putting together. It seems to me that's a very important point, and one that is ignored, certainly, in the mainstream media. There's another aspect of that, or perhaps that's an aspect of a general program that the Obama administration has undertaken almost in secret. I'm quoting here Andrew Basovich. In an initiative that has attracted remarkable little public attention, the Obama administration has announced plans to modernize and upgrade the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Estimated costs of this program reach as high as $1 trillion over the next 3 decades. Once finished, probably just in time for the 100th anniversary of Hiroshima, the United States will possess more flexible, precise, survivable, as they say in the business, and therefore usable nuclear capabilities than anything hitherto imagined. In effect, the country will have acquired a first strike capability, close quote. Now that's from the part of a really fairly silly article by Andrew Basovich, but it's the crucial point, it seems to me, that's worth making. I'd like to ask Ron about what this means in terms of what he thinks this means in terms of the American policy. We've been hearing throughout the Obama administration, and they inherited that the U.S. was establishing a missile defense against ballistic missiles, particularly nuclear and nuclear missiles, coming from Iran. And that this defense, while the U.S. is upgrading its own nuclear strike force, this defense includes things based throughout Europe, missiles based throughout Europe and so forth, to stop the Iranian nuclear weapons from raining down on Europe or American assets in Europe. Oh, this is all very strange because the U.S. has, the Obama administration has instituted an agreement with Iran that everyone agrees sharply cuts back any possibility of the Iranians making a nuclear weapon. But have you heard anything about a retardation of the missile defense that the U.S. is putting in place? The Russians are jeering. They're saying, look, it was never against Iran, it was always against us. And that's proved by the fact that it continues. The Obama administration's missile defense in Europe has not lost a step with the agreement with Iran.
Yeah.
If this is right, Ron?
Well, yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion in the minds of many Americans about how we're going to make America great again. And what that translates to is that we're the most powerful, far and away the most powerful. Example of this in an article I saw recently in USA Today, January 21st, revealed Germany is the best country in the world. Where are they getting this?
This was done by a German firm?
Oh, no. It's something that came out of Davos, Switzerland.
Oh, about the the economic summit. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
And the study is a joint project between the U.S. News and World Report. the New York-based strategic brand consultancy, BAV Consulting, and the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business, the group launched the Best Countries website in Davos to highlight the findings. This says, although the United States came in 4th overall, it is the most powerful country, according to the report. So how could we come in only 4th if we're the most powerful country? Again,
it's the best country competition.
Right,
Yes,
right.
yes,
Yeah.
What's the guy
How a nation is perceived outside its borders is critical to its success, said the WPP's chief executive officer. Smart, thoughtful, and responsible administrations pay attention to image and reputation because a better image contributes toward more foreign direct investment, more tourism, and a made in or created in premium, this guy said. David Rebstein, a professor of marketing at the Wharton School, said the spending power of consumers in a country contributed to its ranking. So that's what greatness and being best means to Americans, is that we have the best image, and we have that because we're the most powerful, far and away the most powerful. Yeah. And they don't touch upon the question of whether we're being impoverished by all this escalation of weapons. According to some, that's really what brought down the Soviet Union in the arms race. They couldn't keep up with the USA in that kind of spending. And eventually, since we had the most money to spend on weapons, which we've been doing, of course, all along, Soviet Union broke down. They just couldn't keep that up. So there it is. Are we going to make America great again? And what is that supposed to mean? I don't know. Ask someone else, not me.
Thank you, Ron. You want to raise a question about some of the things that have been said so far?
Oh, sorry,
Okay.
Ron, go ahead.
We'll just go in order. We won't forget you, Karen. I assure
Oh,
you.
that's all right.
No, nothing more at the moment.
Okay, Karen, go ahead.
Not on the weapons, which I posted an article just, maybe it was this morning, yesterday, whatever, that dealt with Pentagon and the weapons and all of that. I want to make a comment which is a little off target here. I've mentioned the Council on Foreign Relations many times as being the major advisory group to the U.S. administration. And I was hopeful that maybe there was some kind of dispute amongst them. You know, we talked about how when the Johnson administration, which was very hawkish and militaristic regarding the war in Vietnam, and George McBundy was one of the major...
George Bundy, by the way. The only reason I know is that he was, I knew him at university, and everyone made fun of the fact that the Mick was in the wrong place.
Right,
so to
it's
speak.
Mick George Bundy.
Right.
Yeah, he was a major influence as a member of the council, though they have many members, influencing Johnson, until they got together after the Tet Offensive. And there were many meetings took place. Now the meetings within the council are confidential, but then they have luncheons and they have dinners and they have people who are not members. But that they came to the conclusion finally, and this would have been 68, I think it was around March 68, they then came to Johnson and they told him that they really believed at this point they needed a change in strategy in Vietnam, that the military option wasn't working. And the three main reasons were, one, the Tet Offensive. They recognized that they just couldn't beat the Vietnamese militarily, okay? It just wasn't going to happen. Too much money was being spent on that option. But also, and this is very important, was the peace movement. I mean, they felt that the U.S. we were so divided, there was so much happening, that it really needed, they were really affected by all of the uprisings across the nation. And it's interesting because even though I lived during that time and thought I was aware, It's only when I go into the books, and the Imperial Brain Trust, the Council on Foreign Relations that was published in '77, goes into it in a little more detail. They were influenced, and so they influenced Johnson. And he was really, you know, as I said last week, he was really shocked that, of all people, McGeorge Bundy would be suddenly become, you know, in favor of backing off from the military option. So even when the head of the Pentagon came to him and told Johnson, in spite of the 500,000 troops we had in Vietnam, we needed, I think, 20,000 more, I forget how many more, Johnson had to say no. Okay. And then, as we know, Johnson then, he did not run for another term, and they started withdrawing troops, et cetera, et cetera. So it did take them a long time before we actually physically ended the military option, okay. I was hopeful because I had seen Philip Gordon being interviewed by Charlie Rose on the Charlie Rose Show. This was in September, and I mentioned it here on the show. Philip Gordon was a very prominent member of the CFR. He was a very close advisor to President Obama, and he was positioning himself as a speaking member, speaking on behalf of the CFR by having this big CFR sign behind him. And he was saying that he thought that our military option, this is the way I'm perceiving it, in Syria and in the Middle East wasn't working very well. And we needed to do something about that. So I was thinking about that today after reading the CFR book and thinking that these advisors, maybe there is enough dispute going on within the council and amongst the advisors to the Obama administration. Then you have the Pentagon. Then you have, you know, maybe there's enough dispute that maybe we could actually see some change in policy. And then I downloaded an article that Philip Gordon had written. He's evidently not, he's now considered an advisor to the Obama administration. So I don't know what happened there. But this was written in June in Politico. This goes before he was on the Charlie Rose Show. And the title is The Middle East is Falling Apart, but America isn't to blame. And there's no easy fix.
It's not our fault.
And I thought, okay, it's not our fault. Or is he saying it's not my fault?
Right.
And sure enough, I start reading the article, and he makes it very clear that there are 4 reasons why the Middle East strategy is not working. Basically, he goes through it. But the number one reason is that the great unraveling, as he calls it, and it has to do with the borders not being protected, and it has to do with the leaders, you know, not being there. And basically he blames it all on the Arab Spring. So I was like, oh my God. And I did hear this being spouted by some woman on Crosstalk, which is on RT, on the Peter Lavelle show, was saying the same thing. Fortunately, Peter Lavelle and a couple of his people on Crosstalk, they immediately, you know, like, you got to be kidding. You know, it has nothing to do with the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring did not bring down these nations, okay? It was U.S. intervention, bombing, regime change, all of that. So my hopes were dashed. And I think, Carl, you posted something on something that I had posted either last night or this morning. You were talking about how, yes, and now, you know, we have what's his name, Ash Carter?
Yes.
Ashton Carter, right, our head of defense. We have him talking about, you know, boots on the ground. We have Biden. We have Kerry. You know, we're getting these messages that, yes, we're going to have peace talks, but, and then they talk about boots on the ground. And so I don't know what's happening. I'm interested in hearing any comments either you or Ron have to.
Well, we've got to remember that Carter has this last week announced more boots on the ground in Iraq, and last week more boots on the ground in Syria. And I mean, he's even used the phrase, So the idea that the Obama administration is avoiding that is simply false.
Right.
They have been waging war by proxy in Syria for a long time. That's what Benghazi was all about, after all. And the war in Iraq, which Obama claims to have ended, of course, never ended. And it continues today with American troops and even more American mercenaries involved. And of course, both places are awash with American weapons. The civil war in Syria and the ongoing civil war in Iraq is fueled by American armaments. And this is, this continues to be the case. Even the Obama administration admits that there will be troops throughout Southwest Asia when Obama leaves office. But there was a more disturbing aspect of this this week during the big snowstorm in Washington. This is from the Ron Paul Institute about it. While the Washington snowstorm dominated news coverage this week, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who remember is a Republican, was operating behind the scenes to rush through the Senate what may be the most massive transfer of power from the legislative to the executive branch in history. The senior senator, you don't have to believe that to see the importance of what's being said. The senior senator from Kentucky is scheming, along with Senator Lindsey Graham, to bypass normal Senate procedure to fast-track legislation to grant the president the authority to wage unlimited war for as long as he or his successors may wish, wherever they may wish. The legislation makes the unconstitutional Iraq War authorization of 2002. Remember, Congress voted
Right.
a authorization for the use of military force in Iraq, and
AUMF.
AUMF, exactly, of extremely questionable constitutional legitimacy, makes that Iraq AUMF look like a walk in the park. It will allow the president, the new one, McConnell's new one, will allow the president and future presidents to wage war against ISIS without restrictions on time, geographic scope, or the use of ground troops, wherever they want. It's a completely open-ended authorization for the president to use the military as he wishes for as long as he or she wishes. Even President Obama has expressed concern over how willing Congress is to hand him unlimited power to wage war. Now, that always has to be read in Obama's classic fake left, drive right, approach. So, I mean, I don't make much sense of that. But the fact that the administration and the Senate Republicans are together on this matter should concern us all. President Obama has already far surpassed even his predecessor, George Bush, in taking the country to war without even the fig leaf of an authorization. In 2011, the president invaded Libya, overthrew its government, and oversaw the assassination of its leader without even bothering to ask for congressional approval. Interesting side note for those of us who were in Champaign-Urbana in those days, the then congressman, a Republican, from the Champaign-Urbana area joined a number of other Republican and Democratic congressmen in going to court saying this is illegal. The president can't, under the Constitution and the War Powers Act, set off on a war on his own. And the court refused to hear it on the grounds that it was a political decision, and the point being that they had an obvious legal case, but the court didn't want to have anything to do with it. And it came up around the back in the Benghazi hearings where the real scope and activity that the Obama administration was operating through Benghazi was ignored. The Ron Paul Institute continues, it's becoming more clear that Washington plans to extend its war in the Middle East. Last week, the media reported the U.S. military had taken over an air base in eastern Syria, and Defense Secretary Ashton Carter said the U.S. would send in the 101st Airborne Division to retake Mosul in Iraq and to attack ISIS headquarters in Raqqa, Syria. Now, the U.S. quietly but publicly announced the 101st Airborne was being sent into the Iraq and Syria civil wars. and you know, it created barely a ripple. I bet
Right.
you did not hear about it in the evening news. Then on Saturday, Vice President Joe Biden said that if the upcoming peace talks in Geneva were not successful, and they've now been postponed to the end of the month, the U.S. is prepared for a massive military intervention in Syria. Such an action would likely place the U.S. military face to face with the Russian military, whose assistance was requested by the Syrian government. In contrast, we must remember that the U.S. military is operating in Syria in violation of international law. Now, the prospects of such an escalation by the Obama administration on its way out is not all that far-fetched. At the insistence of Saudi Arabia and with U.S. backing, the representatives of the Syrian opposition at the Geneva peace talks will include members of the Army of Islam, which has fought with al-Qaeda in Syria. Does anyone expect these kinds of people this kind of person to compromise? Isn't al-Qaeda supposed to be our enemy? Well, if you want the backstory of that, see the article by Andrew Coburn in the current issue of Harper's, in which he points out that the U.S. has always been down with al-Qaeda. Indeed, the U.S. created al-Qaeda and the other jihadist forces in the 1970s in order to annoy the Russians. So there's an important backstory here. The article is entitled Special Relationship, and that's indeed been the relationship between the U.S. and al-Qaeda from the beginning. The purpose of the Ron Paul Institute concludes, the purpose of the legislative branch of our government is to restrict the executive branch's power. The founders understood that an all-powerful king who could wage war at will was the greatest threat to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And there's at least a germ of truth in that. Read Tom Paine, for example, if you want to. That is why they created a people's branch, the Congress. You might laugh about that, but that, once again, is the ideal, not the reality, to prevent the emergence of an all-powerful autocrat to drag the country to endless war. Sadly, Congress is surrendering its power to declare war, and of course it has been surrendering it for a good long time. This is a critique from the only section of the American politics that actually is anti-interventionists. We heard about the pro-interventionists, the liberal interventionists amongst the liberal neocons just recently, but the only segment is that segment of the so-called libertarian movement around Ron Paul that has been calling for a withdrawal of American troops and an end to this intervention. The Obama administration, on the contrary, and clearly Mrs. Clinton as part of that, are pressing for the most extreme form of interventionism, and right now they seem to have the Senate Majority Leader running interference for them. Comments on this, folks?
Yeah.
You don't sound pleased.
Well,
right?
there's too much there to really deal with here, but it's true, I'm told, that there have been no officially sanctioned wars, no declarations of war by Congress since 1941.
Mm-hmm.
And everything since then has been an administrative war. Apparently relying on the authority of the president as commander-in-chief to do whatever he pleases with the American military, and without bothering to get approval from Congress. So there's a long story there of what some political thinkers have seen as the rise of an all-powerful executive since World War II. What's sometimes called Caesarism or Bonapartism, the elected dictator. And a lot of supposed democracies apparently have been degenerating in this respect and toward this. And is it inevitable? Well, I hope not. But yeah, I can see the tendency there. The top executive wants to wield sovereign power without reference to these ankle-biting legislators who are not down with the program. So yeah, there's a much bigger and longer term problem there, I think. But what can be done about it in the short run, I'm not sure.
Comment,
Well,
Karen?
my comment or my question on this, which I'm glad you dealt with this, Carl, because this is precisely what I was concerned with. The AUMF has managed to cover most of our incursions so far, right?
That's the claim, yeah.
That's the claim.
Yeah, there are two AUMFs, of course, one after 9/11 and one in regard to Iraq. And the Obama administration claims that they basically can do everything the new resolution makes provision for, that is carry on war throughout Southwest Asia, indeed around the world, under those early, the 2001 and 2002 AUMF.
Right.
So
Well,
situation is, from the point of view of the administration, is clear. They got the authority they need.
right, but it would beg the question as to why they would now need this. And my concern is that this would be perhaps if we were actually going to what we call a big war, like World War III, like Russia, like China. I know I sound like such a fearmonger, but there's a reason to be fearful. So I'm just wondering if this is in preparation for an attack on the Ukraine or some such.
I think
don't
the
know.
way, maybe the way to look on that is, the fact is the U.S. policy really hasn't changed at all
Right.
since the Second World War. What George Kennan talked about after the Second World War about the U.S. policy to maintain the disparity. He says, look, we have 5% of the world's population and 50% of the world's wealth. To maintain that disparity, we're going to have to work hard, and that's not going to be a matter of playing by the rules. It's going to be a matter of military force. And the U.S. essentially has worked on that throughout the period since the Second World War. And the overriding strategic notion, as expressed by people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, is that what's at stake is the control of what's been called in diplomatic language since the turn of the century the world island, that is Eurasia, Central Asia, that is Russia and China today. And that American policy has always been directed towards that since Woodrow Wilson invaded Russia in 1917. Most Americans don't know that the United States invaded Russia in 1917, but indeed we did, because there had been a communist revolution in Russia, and we couldn't stand around and let that happen. The activities of the United States in regard of control of Eurasia has been at the center of American politics, including the need to control Mideast oil. And so the great debate after the Second World War over who lost China, after all, China was ours, wasn't it? And therefore, if it's not ours anymore, somebody must have done something wrong, is part of the ongoing, continuing, not new, American policy of controlling this, of controlling this vast region of the world, finally by war and the threat of war. That hasn't changed, and every administration, Republican and Democrat, has followed that. The tactics change. What are we going to continue to fight a war in Southeast Asia? Are we going to continue to fight a war in East Asia? And now, perhaps, to what extent are we going to continue to fight a war in Southwest Asia? Those decisions are made under the umbrella of the general policy of we've got to keep Russia and China down. And as you were pointing out so clearly earlier, Karen, the rise of China and the resurgence of Russia under Putin is causing great headaches in Washington, and they are willing to do almost anything, up to and including nuclear war, to prevent it. This is scary. It should be scary.
Yeah, that's the only conclusion I can come to, that they would require giving this legislative power to the president as if he really needs it, given the fact that he's been, we've been functioning without it.
Exactly.
But we know that what they want to do is legitimize what they do, especially when they're leaving office.
Or they might be thrown into jail the way the Bush administration
Exactly.
was for its illegal activities while in office, right?
Right, of course,
Yeah,
of course.
right.
only if they travel to specific nations, but then
Not including
some-
the United States.
Right,
yeah.
right, but then some of those nations still will have them, will invite them to particular meetings and lift the, order to arrest upon, entrance.
I think there's some discomfort. Can the earlier authorization for the use of military force, the AUMF, be stretched
Yes.
indefinitely to cover all of these
That's
things?
That's right.
And there's more
precisely.
and more unease
Yes.
about that.
That's
Is
right.
it infinitely
Yes.
elastic?
Exactly.
Exactly.
Or because Obama keeps saying that he has sufficient authority to do whatever he's doing now.
Yes.
Exactly.
But he wants a more clear and explicit.
Right.
Authority.
That's exactly what I'm thinking, and we're all thinking, but I'm wondering if there is a reason that we're going to be going into a greater war now, and therefore they
Yeah.
are really focusing on.
It's a
Well, if
legitimate
McConnell
worry.
anticipates that there will be a Republican president in a year, then
Yeah.
he may want to remove all constraints
That's
on that
possible.
person's military operation.
As you say, it doesn't look like the Democrats have faced many constraints in that regard.
Right.
Yeah.
There's an aspect of that, by the way, that has also slipped under the radar, as so much of the Obama foreign policy does. That's the fact that Obama right now has an army that is essentially a private presidential army. It doesn't depend upon Congress. It doesn't even depend directly on the chain of command in the Pentagon. The so-called Special Operation Forces report directly to the National Security Council, which is Obama's self-summon. I mean, he picks who sits on the National Security Council.
Right.
That's his the organ that's in charge of running foreign policy, national security policy, as we say. That is military policy. The Special Operation Forces are chosen from throughout the American military. It amounts to 70,000 people, actually more than that now. That's more than the size of the military of most European armies. The entire military of France and Germany and so forth are smaller than the Special Operation Forces that are under the direct command of the president right now.
Okay.
So, I mean, this the situation is not desperate if you want to run a war from the White House.
Yeah, there was a controversy many years ago about whether the president should have what is essentially a Praetorian Guard or a Waffen-SS or something for protection against unrest domestically, but I think this is a different question.
And now he does.
Yeah. Well,
You've been
How
watching
long?
Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 4th week of 2016. Another week in which the Obama administration's drone assassination program, the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has yet seen, is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to by the panel and announcements of upcoming events. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. This is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zook, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.